Greetings, everybody. My name is Sanjiv Venkatram, and welcome to another edition of User Delight with Microsoft Technology. What we'll do in this episode is talk about the various ways by which we can create a master date table in Power Query within Power BI. So let's head on over to Power Query to know more. Thank you very much.
Right. We are here in our Power Query, and the idea here is to go ahead and create the dates table in a few different ways depending on the number of records we have in our transaction tables. So as an example, in the first method, we've got two transaction tables, the sales and expense, each with its own date column. And when the number of records are, let us say, below F500,000, and this is by experience, what we can do is to derive the dates column right from the transaction tables. What this does is as the transactions grow week on week, the dates table automatically basically updates with the latest end date. So that's what we're going to do in the first instance, right? And the requirement for the dates column is that the dates have to be contiguous without any gaps. So if I were to head on over to my Excel here, this lays out the steps that we can actually do in order for us to get to the dates table. So the first one is to get a consolidated list of dates from the transaction tables. We've got two, so we get a consolidated list, right? And the second one is to extract the start and end dates from the consolidated list. As an example, if I have the 1710 today's date as a start date from my consolidated list, and if I have the end dates, I get these two dates, and what I do is I actually get numbers corresponding to these dates, right? The third step here is to get the numbers corresponding to the start date and the end date. Then I actually get a contiguous set of numbers. So if I were to increment this by 1 here, so I get a contiguous set of numbers between the start number and the end number. And finally, I select everything and I actually reconvert it back into date. So that's what we're going to do in Power Query in method 1. And again, to jog your memory, method 1 is when we have the data set that is less than, let us say, 500,000 rows. And for small and medium businesses, in fact, it could be well below 100,000 rows is when we adopt this method, right? So I'm going to basically go to the right here, new query in my Power Query, and I'm going to add a blank query. I'm going to go over to the advanced editor, and in this source variable in the let block, I'm going to actually add a combined list. So I'm going to say list combine, and I pick up my list.combine function, open the bracket, and then I'm going to basically make this a list. So I need a curly brace. So I'm going to hit enter twice. So in the first instance, I'm going to go ahead and use a function called table column to get the dates column in my transaction sales. So I'm going to basically, it is asking me for my transaction table. So I'm going to actually quote the transaction sales. And it's asking me for the column name as text. So I need the date column here. So that's my first query. So I'm going to basically copy this over and then hit enter, tab this to be elegant, paste the function over, and I'm going to basically say transaction expense and refer to the dates column. So I'm going to get a consolidated list of dates called source from these two date columns. So if I click done, there you see the consolidated list of dates. So if I go back here, I get this consolidated list. I'm going to mark it in yellow. So I'm going to go back to my advanced editor, and in the next step, I'm going to extract out the start date. So I'll add a variable called start date, and I'm going to actually say, give me the min value in this list.min, and I'm going to pass in the source variable. This gives me the start date, and then I'm going to add a variable to get the end date. Likewise, I'm going to use the list max function and then pass the source variable here. So likewise, I get the start and end dates. Once I've been able to extract the start and end dates, the second step here, these three steps of actually getting the numbers from the start and end dates and then the contiguous numbers and then reconversion, I'm going to do this in one go, right? So I'm going to say comma, and then I'm going to call a variable dates list and set it equal to a list. This is a list of numbers, and I'm going to get the from number from the start date let me pass the start date, the number from the start date, and then 2, and the 2 represents 2 in Power Query, and number from the end date. You follow me? So I've got my start date and end date variable. I'm going to pass it. I'm going to inside this number dot from to get a number corresponding to the start dates and fill out the numbers corresponding to the end date here. And I'm going to actually visualize the variable dates list in my in block. Okay, so I set the dates list here. Let's make sure that I don't have any syntax errors. Start date, end date, list.min. This should work. I go ahead, there are no syntax errors here, so I click on done, and this basically says there is an expression error in start date. Let me actually go back here. Start date is, oh, I need to pull this out, shouldn't I? So I'm gonna cut this, and so that gives me, no wonder, so that gives me my consolidated set of dates. I'm going to say comma, enter, and then pass this, right? And tab this in as well a little bit. There you go. Okay, so this should work. This should give me the start date corresponding to the consolidated list here in source, and if I were to click done, this is going to go away and give me a list of numbers from the start date to the end date. Now I push this back into a table, so I'm going to get a table out of this, to table, and there you go. So that is my table of numbers. I'm going to call this date, and then I'm going to mark this as a data type as the date, and voila, I have my date column. This is very important because with this now, Power BI recognizes this as the date column from which I can build out my dates table. And then if I were to duplicate this, I can extract out the year, the month, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to actually call this the year, and then right mouse on it, transform, hover on the year, and call it the year. Likewise, duplicate this, and I can call this the month, and I right mouse on it, go to transform, hover on the month, and I'm going to call it the name of the month, and so on and so forth. So you can actually fill this out per your requirement, right? So once and I've actually done this up here, so once I have the master dates here, I've added a column here called month year, and if I were to right mouse on the step here, basically what I'm doing is I'm extracting out the 3 letters from the month column here, so Jan, Feb, so on and so forth, concatenating it with a space to be elegant, and extracting out the text from the number, because this whole thing has to be a text in month year. And lo and behold, I actually get my month year. People in finance and HR and so on and so forth, and horizontal functions typically actually use the first 3 letters of the month and the year as a short form of your month and year in the x-axis, if you will. So I get my month year. Now this month year clearly has duplicates over here. So in order for you to actually get a primary key of the month year, what you do is you extract out the month year as a separate table, as a separate master table. Essentially what you're trying to get down to is the lowest denominator, which is a non-duplicate distinct list of month year as a primary key, and that process is called snowflaking. So if I were to go to my master date bridge here, that's what I've done. I've basically gone in my advanced editor, and I've got the column called month year from my master date, and then I converted this into a table with one columns over here, much the same way as we did while we were creating the dates column. So if I go back to the advanced editor here, so I removed the duplicates to make it into a primary key. Then I converted this into a table from a list, and then I renamed the column as month year, and then they changed the type to a text. And once I have this as a text here from Jan all the way through December, I add an index column. If I go to add column, I add an index column so that I can sort by this index. So if I were to delete, since I have everything here, if I were to delete this and essentially close this Power Query and go back into my Power BI, open up my data column here, panel here. In my master date that actually comes in, I click on the three dots and then declare this as a dates table. So if I were to click on mark as a date table, this goes away, asks me to choose the date column, and obviously I've got my dates as the dates column, so I choose it, and then Power BI recognizes this as the dates column. Very important. Now, why does it matter? If I open up my master measures and let us say go to the sales measure and go to, let us say, last year or the CAGR measure here, the compounded annual growth rate, I can then call upon the time intelligence function such as parallel period here, which depends on the date column. So I reference the date column, I indicate the intervals, whether it's 4, 5, the number of years that I want to go back in this case, and the interval itself, which is the year, in order for me to extract out the sales from history, right? So this dates table allows me to go forwards and backwards in time to extract out whichever measure I want to extract. So whether it be either sales or expense or profit or so on and so forth, okay? So this is one way of actually extracting out your date or creating your dates table. The other way, when the number of records actually go beyond 500,000, when you have a number of, and this is for a larger, let us say, medium organization to a very large organization, what you do is instead of actually creating, if I were to go back to my dates table here, instead of actually pulling the consolidated list of dates from the transaction sales, I will actually hard enter it, or I will use a parameter. The reason why I do that is you would have a whole slew of records. So if I were to run this query, it would take a whole bunch of time to refresh, right? So I would recommend doing this as the first approach. See how long it takes to refresh this report. If it takes a long time, then you adopt the second method that we're going to talk about. So here I'm going to basically go to a new query and a blank query. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to in one go hard enter the dates. So I know if I were to go back to my dates, I know my start date is 2/1/2017. So, and my end date correspondingly is 31st/12. So I'm going to write this down. So it is end date is 31/12/2021, and the start date here is 2/1/2017, right? So it is this is the US notation, so it is the January 2nd, 2017 to December 31st, 2021, right? So that is my start and end date. So I'm going to go to this query here. I'm going to the advanced editor, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically say, and I'm going to get a list, and I'm going to say number from, open the bracket, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a hash and date reference. So I'm going to enter the actual date, and the date basically goes by the year, which is 2021, comma, the month, which is 2017, I suppose, was the starting point. So the month is January and the day is 2. So that gives me my start date. And then I'm gonna actually say 2 number from, the end date, which is 2021 is the year, and then I'm going to have to mark a date reference here, right? Hash date, and here gonna actually do the month is December, so 12 31. So I'm gonna actually use this to get the number from the start date to the end date. So let me actually make sure I have my brackets correct. Everything looks good. So this should give me the number corresponding to the 2nd of February 2017 to the 31st of December 2021. Okay, so I'm going to hard enter this now because I don't want the dates to be referencing a long list of dates in my transaction table. That would make the waiting period for the refresh very long. So if I click on done here, this should go away and give me a contiguous list of dates. Okay, so this is going to be my starting point in the second approach. After that, the process is the same. I click on to table and then go ahead and build out my dates table. Okay, so the rest of the stuff is the same, but the starting point is different because I'm going to hard enter the dates. Now, a third approach here is to basically use parameters for the end date instead of actually using a hard entry, right? So there what I could do is I could go in and I could go to manage parameters and create a new parameter here, and then I'm going to call this end date as a parameter, and then the type here is actually a date, and the current value of the date, the end date, I'm going to actually say 31, or I think it's the US notation, so 12/31/2021 as my end date. Let me see if this actually takes it. It says enter a date value. So maybe what I could do is 2021, comma, the month is 12, comma, the day is 31, right? So if I were to do this, it goes away and actually creates a parameter with the current date. And I go back to my query here, I go to the advanced editor, and instead of hard entering the date here, I'm going to actually pass the parameter, right? I'm going to pass the parameter, so I'm going to actually say number from, and this should be the end date parameter, like so. You see, this should be the end date, and then that should be good to go because I've got my, so I click on done, and there you go, no change. So I've got, so now if I were to modify this end date from the 31st 12 to, let us say, 31st of 2017, I'm going to basically say the first month, maybe 15th, right? 15/1/2017, and hit enter here and hit enter and go back to my query. You see it dynamically actually updates, right? Which is absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to call this query as dynamic date table. And then I'm going to bring this over to, I'm going to close and apply, and I'm going to bring this over to my Power BI, right? I'm loading the dates here. So if I were to go over to a blank page, I'm going to enter my end dates here. So if I were to go over to my query that I just entered, the dynamic dates, and then if I click on this column, I get all my dates from January 2nd, 2017 to the 15th of January 2017. And now what I could do is if I were to go to edit parameters over here and then say, hey, give me the 20th, and click on OK. So this actually goes away. If I apply changes, this goes away and dynamically gives me the end date. So this is one way of, when your data set is large, this is one way of actually managing your dates table. So the three different ways, the one, if your data set is small, you derive the dates table directly from the transactions, and it's going to update directly as the Power BI refreshes. If your data set is really large, what you could do is you could go in and you could manually, you select a random end date in the future. As an example, if I say edit parameters here, you enter a date way out in the future, maybe 2035 or something thereabouts, and you can either hard code it or you can make it a parameter, and then you will get your dates table. I trust this is actually helpful to you and makes it easy for you to create your own dates table. Thank you very much.